Imagine building a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire, like an absolute powerhouse of modern commerce.
Right.
But then deciding you never, ever want to step foot outside again.
It's a pretty wild concept.
It is, because that is essentially what happened in Minneapolis. You have these towering skyscrapers, billions of dollars moving through the air, and instead of, walking down the street to grab a coffee, they built an entire secondary city in the sky.
Yeah, literally just so they wouldn't have to put on a winter coat.
Exactly. And it's fascinating.
It is a profound architectural choice, really, and it tells you exactly what you need to know about the psychology of the people who built it, because geography isn't just about where you are. It dictates how you think.
Which is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. So
Yeah.
to you, listening right now, if you've ever felt that strange invisible pressure to have your entire life perfectly optimized, your career, your lawn, your parenting, your fitness.
All of it.
Right, all of it. And without anyone ever actually telling you to do it, if you felt that, you are going to want to hear this.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're exploring a really fascinating psychological map of the Minneapolis and Twin Cities region today.
And we're not just looking at, like, zoning laws or highway grids.
No, not at all. We are breaking this entire region down into distinct, living sub-personalities. It's like we're taking historic riverfronts, wealthy lake towns, massive shopping meccas, and we're treating them like guests at a very complex dinner party.
Yeah, by assigning these areas human personas, so we're talking names like Devin, Kelly, Val, Liz Wee, can actually decode the collective anxieties and ambitions of a culture.
It's like putting a community's collective mind on an X-ray table.
That's a great way to put it.
But, to understand the modern, polished, climate-controlled present, we kind of have to start in the mud.
We have to look at the raw engine that built the whole thing.
Exactly. Let's look at the bedrock. The tension between ancient nature and brutal industry. The personas we are dealing with here are Kelly, who represents the deep, ancient natural roots of the Minnesota landscape, and then Devin, who represents the Mississippi River, specifically through the lens of heavy industry.
Right, and the natural history here is just staggering. I mean, it sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about. People casually throw around the phrase land of 10,000 lakes.
Which is already a lot of lakes.
It is, but the reality is actually closer to 11,800 lakes.
Wait, really? Almost 12,000.
Yeah, and these weren't, gentle puddles that just formed over a few rainy seasons.
Yeah.
They're violent geological scars.
Scars.
Yeah, because thousands of years ago, the Laurentide ice sheet, specifically this massive glacier known as the Des Moines Lobe, literally bulldozed this landscape. I mean, it scraped the earth right down to the bedrock.
Wow.
And when it melted, it left behind this incredibly porous, waterlogged terrain.
So it's an environment defined by extremes from the very beginning. I mean, long before European settlement, the Dakota and Ojibwe peoples navigated an ecosystem of dense white pine forests, plunging winter temperatures, and waterways that just froze solid for half the year.
It was not an easy place to live.
No. If you've ever heard the call of a common loon echoing across a glassy lake at dusk, it's this haunting, almost prehistoric sound.
Yeah.
It really reminds you that this landscape demands absolute respect. You don't conquer a Midwestern winter, you just survive it.
Right, and then comes Devin.
The persona of industry.
Exactly. European immigrants arrive, heavily Scandinavian, German, Eastern European, and they look at this freezing, uncompromising wilderness and decide, they're going to put it to work.
Which brings us to the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
I think most people, when they picture the Mississippi, they see this wide, muddy, lazy river rolling down through New Orleans.
Right, the Tom Sawyer image.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But in Minneapolis, it is a completely different beast.
Because of St. Anthony Falls. It is the only natural waterfall on the entire 2,300-mile length of the Mississippi River.
Which is wild to think about, just one waterfall in that massive river.
Yeah, the Dakota called it Owamni, which translates to falling water. And the geology of it is fascinating. It's basically a hard limestone cap sitting over soft, easily eroded sandstone. So as the water rushes over, it undercuts the sandstone, and then the limestone just breaks off in massive chunks. It is pure, raw, kinetic energy.
And in the late 1800s, Industrialists looked at that kinetic energy and saw a massive, watery conveyor belt.
That's exactly what they saw.
It wasn't about the view. Nobody was setting up a picnic. It was about the velocity of industry. They built lock and dam systems. They floated millions of tons of timber from the northern pine forest down the river to be milled. But, I mean, the real game changer was the flour.
Oh, absolutely. The flour mills transformed Minneapolis into the flour milling capital of the world.
Capital of the world.
Yeah, companies like Pillsbury and Washburn Crosby, they built these colossal stone and brick monoliths right on the edge of the falls. I mean, they were grinding wheat from the Great Plains into flour to literally feed the world. But here is the thing about industrial velocity. It is incredibly dangerous.
Wait, okay, I want to pause here for a second, because when you say flour milling is dangerous, I think most people, they imagine a baker with a rolling pin and a little cloud of white dust. How dangerous can flour actually be?
Catastrophically dangerous. And this is actually a defining moment for the Bevan persona. So, on May 2, 1878, the Washburn Mill, which was the largest flour mill in the world at the time, exploded.
Exploded?
Yeah, and it didn't just catch fire, it detonated.
How does flour detonate? I don't understand the physics of that.
It comes down to the surface area to volume ratio. So when wheat is ground into really fine flour dust, it becomes highly combustible. If that dust gets suspended in the air inside a confined space, the oxygen exposure is maximized. So all it takes is a single spark.
Just one spark?
Just one. On that day in 1878, the massive millstones likely rubbed together, they were running dry, and they threw a spark. That spark ignited the airborne dust, and the first explosion blew out the windows.
Which I assume just disturbed more dust.
Exactly. It created this massive chain reaction. The blast was so powerful it leveled the massive limestone building. It killed 18 workers, destroyed half a dozen nearby mills, and literally shattered windows across the entire city.
That is absolutely terrifying. It literally blew the industrial heart of the city off the map.
It did. But here is where we start to see the cultural DNA begin to form. They didn't abandon the site, they rebuilt the mill, and more importantly, they implemented early, vital industrial safety reforms, things like dust collection systems and better ventilation.
So if we look at what that environment does to the human psyche, it's profound. I mean, on one hand, you have winters that can freeze you to death if you aren't prepared, and on the other hand, you have factory labor that can literally explode if you aren't disciplined.
That is the crucible. The environment, both natural and industrial, was this force that required constant vigilance. So the mill workers, the loggers, the immigrants, they developed an identity built on practicality, resilience, and a sort of quiet pride.
A quiet pride.
Yeah. It is not a glamorous culture at all. It is survival refined into discipline.
Survival refined into discipline. I love that. And I want you, listening right now, to think about the foundational industries of your own hometown. Was it a coal town? Was it textiles, steel, maybe fishing? Think about how the specific dangers and demands of those ghost industries still shape the local work ethic and the attitude of the people there today. Because in Minneapolis, that stoic, disciplined survival instinct became the foundation for everything that followed.
Which, perfectly explains how the wealth generated by all that dangerous flour and timber was eventually spent.
Right, because it didn't just evaporate.
No, it's centralized. It built the modern metropolis.
Which brings us to Section 2, the urban brain and the skyway heart. We leave the raw riverbanks and move into the city core, which is represented by the persona Val, and then across the river to the University of Minnesota, represented by the persona Tira. Let's tackle Val first.
Because we are moving from soot and brick to glass and steel.
Exactly. Downtown Minneapolis is a really dense corporate hub. It's anchored by the IDS Center, this massive skyscraper just looming over Nicollet Mall.
But as we teased earlier, the most defining feature of Val isn't the height of the buildings. It is what connects them, the skyway system.
This is one of the most fascinating urban design choices in the whole country, because the corporate world basically looked at that brutal winter, that survival refined into disciplined winter, and decided, actually, we have enough money now to just opt out of winter entirely.
Exactly. We're done with the cold. The skyways are an interconnected network of enclosed, climate-controlled pedestrian footbridges, and they connect the second floors of almost every major building downtown.
We are talking over 9 miles of pathways, right?
Over 9 miles, yeah.
It's like they built a terrarium for capitalism. I mean, you can live in a luxury high-rise, walk through a glass tube to your investment banking job, meet a client for lunch, grab your dry cleaning, and hit a happy hour. All while the temperature outside is 20 degrees below zero. You'd literally never have to put on a coat.
And we really have to examine the psychology of that. Urban planners called this concept grade separation.
Grade separation. Okay.
By moving the primary pedestrian flow to the second floor, they essentially abandoned the street level to the elements and the automobiles. It creates this highly optimized environment designed to eliminate all physical friction.
Right, so you don't wait for crosswalks.
You don't slip on ice, but you also don't experience the serendipity or the grit of the actual city. It's pure, uninterrupted corporate and commercial flow.
It's insulation, literally and metaphorically.
Hmm.
But, Val isn't the only persona shaping the city's brain. Right across the Mississippi River, you have Tira, representing the University of Minnesota. And the timeline here is kind of wild. The university was founded in 1851, but Minnesota didn't even become a state until 1858.
Which speaks volumes about the priorities of those early settlers. Even before they had official statehood, they understood that education and research were the ultimate tools for mastering this crazy environment. The University of Minnesota is a massive Big Ten research institution, and it was driven by the Morrill Land Grant Act, which focused on teaching agriculture, science, and engineering.
Because they didn't just want a classical education. They needed practical solutions. Like, how do we grow crops in this super short season? How do we engineer better bridges so they don't collapse in the ice?
Precisely. And their footprint in medical research is historic. I mean, what's fascinating here is how they approached medicine. In the 1950s, a University of Minnesota surgeon named Dr. C. Walton Littlehay essentially pioneered open heart surgery.
Wait, how did he do that in the 1950s? They didn't have modern bypass machines back then, did they?
They didn't. He used a technique called cross-circulation. He literally linked the circulatory system of the patient, often a child with a severe heart defect, to the circulatory system of an adult donor, which was usually a parent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so the parent's heart and lungs oxygenated the blood for both of them, while Littlehay repaired the child's heart.
That is mind-blowing and incredibly risky.
It was incredibly risky, but it was that same ambitious, problem-solving DNA that harnessed the waterfall in the first place. However, Tira isn't just a sterile laboratory. The campus has a fierce history of progressive activism, too. Like in 1969, Black student activists took over Morrill Hall to demand a dedicated African-American studies department.
Which they successfully achieved, right?
They did, and there were massive anti-Vietnam War protests there as well.
Okay, let me push back here for a second, because isn't it incredibly hypocritical to have this progressive activist university right next door to the ultimate capitalist terrarium of the skyways? I mean, you have corporate insulation on one side of the river and radical protest on the other.
I wouldn't call it hypocritical, it's more symbiotic. The tension between those two forces is what generates the region's specific energy. Val represents wealth generation, optimized systems, and intense corporate ambition. Tira represents fierce, progressive questioning and human-centric research.
So they balance each other out.
They check each other, yeah. It creates a city that is simultaneously highly business-oriented, hosting numerous Fortune 500 headquarters, and deeply socially conscious at the same time.
But as that urban core swelled, as the university churned out graduates and the corporation hired them, the city just couldn't contain the population anymore. Following World War II, the boom pushed people outward. The executives needed somewhere to live. And that created a whole new challenge. Where do all these practical, successful people go when they want to escape the concrete?
Well, they engineer a new kind of utopia, the suburbs.
Which introduces us to our next set of personas. We have Kenny representing Chaska, Tommy representing Bloomington, and Mac representing Shakopee. This is where the region takes the concept of the skyway, that idea of controlling your environment to guarantee the outcome, and applies it to massive swaths of residential land.
Let's start with Kenny, the persona of Chaska. In the late 1960s, a state senator named Henry McKnight looked at the sprawling, kind of organic growth of typical suburbs and thought, we can do this better. We can design it perfectly from the ground up.
Right.
He helped spearhead the Jonathan Association, which became one of the very first planned communities in the United States, utilizing funding from HUD's New Communities program.
So they didn't just pave roads and sell lots.
Yeah.
How exactly do you plan a community from scratch?
You engineer the sociology. The Jonathan Association was designed with distinct villages, and they were connected by extensive green belts and pedestrian underpasses. The idea was that a child could walk to school, and an adult could walk to the village center without ever having to cross a major street.
That's fascinating.
They mandated specific architectural styles, integrated varying income levels in the initial plans, and placed a massive emphasis on civic order.
It's the ultimate manifestation of keep things running right. It's a culture of Friday night lights, youth sports, manicured parks, and intense civic pride. Maintaining a clean, orderly life isn't just a preference there, it's the actual structural design of the neighborhood.
Exactly. But if Chaska is the engineering of residential leisure, Bloomington, represented by our persona Tommy, is the engineering of pure spectacle.
Yes, because Bloomington is home to the Mall of America.
Right?
And honestly, calling it a mall feels like an insult. It's like a sovereign nation of retail. It has an entire indoor theme park, Nickelodeon universe right in the center of it, roller coasters under massive glass skylights.
And the history of how it got there is brilliant. The Mall of America is actually built directly over the old Metropolitan Stadium.
I love this detail so much. Explain how that transition happened.
So for decades, the Minnesota Twins and the Minnesota Vikings played outdoors at the Met Stadium. Fans would sit on frozen aluminum bleachers in December to watch football.
Which sounds miserable.
It was. But in the early 1980s, the teams moved downtown into the newly built indoor Metrodome.
There's that Skyway mentality again. Just move it indoors.
Exactly. So you have this massive parcel of land sitting empty in Bloomington. Enter the Gramesian brothers, a family of real estate developers who specialized in megamalls. They pitched an enclosed retail and entertainment complex so massive it would become a global tourist destination.
And they kept some of the baseball history, didn't they?
They did. When they built the indoor amusement park, they placed a brass plaque exactly where home plate used to be, and they hung a red stadium seat on the wall to mark the exact spot of the longest home run ever hit there by Harmon Killebrew.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They literally traded an outdoor baseball diamond, exposed to the freezing rain and snow, for indoor roller coasters in a perpetually 70-degree, climate-controlled spectacle. It is the ultimate pivot from outdoor grit to indoor leisure.
It is the exact same psychological impulse that built the Skyways, just applied to entertainment. They enclose the experience to guarantee the outcome. No rainouts, no freezing temperatures, just endless optimized consumption.
But not all suburban entertainment is neatly contained under glass. If we look at Mac, the persona representing Shakopee, we see a much more complex layering of history and modern spectacle. Shakopee has Valley Fair, which is the biggest outdoor amusement park in the state. It has Canterbury Park for horse racing. And it has the Mystic Lake Casino Hotel, this massive neon-lit entertainment hub owned by the Shakopee-Stereo Sioux community.
It is a powerhouse of regional tourism. But underneath the casinos, the carnival games, and the Renaissance Festival turkey legs lies some of the darkest history in the region. Shakopee and the surrounding Minnesota River Valley are deeply tied to the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862.
That is a very stark juxtaposition. Walk us through that history, because it's critical to understanding the Map persona.
In the mid-1800s, through treaties like the Treaty of Traverse du Sioux, the Dakota people were pressured into ceding millions of acres of their ancestral land to the U.S. government, and this was in exchange for annuities, cash, and food. But by the summer of 1862, the government had completely failed to deliver those payments on time.
So they were starving.
The Dakota were starting on a very narrow reservation, and the tension boiled over into a brief, incredibly brutal 6-week war. It ended with the mass execution of 38 Dakota men in Mankato, which is still the largest mass execution in U.S. history, and the forced removal of the Dakota from Minnesota.
It is a profound trauma. And today you have thousands of families driving down those exact same River Valley roads to go to a water park or play blackjack.
It speaks to how American communities process complex history. You know, sometimes we acknowledge it, but often we simply build over it with spectacle. The suburban utopia isn't just about creating fun. It is a mechanism for moving forward. It's paving over the messy, painful realities of the past with clean, engineered leisure.
It is jarring, but it is a fundamental part of the geographical psychology. So we've gone from the raw industrial river to the corporate terrarium of the skyways to the sprawling, engineered utopias of the suburbs. But eventually, this suburban sprawl hits the water again, and when it does, the culture just fractures.
It fractures into two distinct, fascinating microclimates of class, status, and wealth.
Welcome to the lake life dichotomy, flannel versus Lululemon. The personas here are Addie, representing towns like Victoria and Waconia, and Liz, representing Wayzata and the Lake Minnetonka area. Both of these personas represent communities centered entirely around lake life.
But the kind of lake life is completely different. It is a masterclass in the nuances of regional identity. Let's examine Addie first. Victoria and Waconia sit further out on the western edge of the suburban ring. They represent the exurban agricultural roots.
This is the flannel side of the dichotomy. The culture here is deeply centered on community and utility. We're talking 4th of July pontoon parades, county fairs, bonfires, and ice fishing. And by the way, ice fishing isn't just sitting on a bucket in the wind anymore. People drag actual miniature houses out onto the frozen lake, complete with heaters and flat-screen TVs.
It's quite the setup, but the aesthetic remains very practical. It is worn-out jeans, heavy boots, and Carhartt jackets. The wealth that exists in the Addy persona is quiet. The social currency isn't what car you drive, it's your willingness to help a neighbor pull a stuck truck out of a snowbank. Or showing up to the local high school hockey game. It is genuine, community-centered, Midwestern humility.
But then you drive a bit north to Wayzata, to our persona Liz. Wayzata sits on the shores of Lake Minnetonka, and it is a completely different universe.
Wayzata is affluent. It is old money lake life. Going back to the late 1800s, this was where wealthy tourists from the south and east would take steamboats to stay at grand hotels. Today, zip codes like 55391 aren't just addresses, they are status flexes.
Wayzata is where the wealth generated by Val, the corporate downtown executives in the Skyways, goes to relax on the weekends. You swap the flannel for boat shoes, linen, and Lululemon athleisure. In the winter, it's not a Carhartt work jacket, it's a $1,000 Canada Goose parka. It is yacht vibes, wine patios overlooking the water, and exclusive country clubs.
Subtle wealth signaling.
Exactly. Nothing loud, but everything is expensive.
What is truly fascinating here, though, is how the famous concept of Minnesota nice mutates when it crosses the border from Victoria into Wayzata.
Oh, we absolutely have to dissect Minnesota nice.
Oh.
Because I think it is wildly misunderstood outside of the Midwest.
It is. In Victoria with Addy, Minnesota nice is largely genuine. It is a warm you betcha when someone asks for a favor. It is rooted in that old immigrant survival mechanism we talked about at the beginning. The winter is trying to kill us all, so we better be kind and share our firewood.
But in Wayzata, with Liz, Minnesota nice becomes a weapon.
Precisely. Think about a duck gliding across a pond. Above the surface, it looks completely serene, elegant, and effortless. But underneath the water, its feet are paddling furiously. That is the psychology of Wayzata.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy.
In an affluent, highly polished society, overt conflict, yelling, bragging, arguing is considered gauche. It is deeply impolite. So competition and social judgment are pushed completely beneath the surface.
It is the velvet line trap. Picture this scenario, right? Two neighbors are standing on a perfectly manicured lawn. One neighbor says, "Oh, you decided to paint your house that shade of blue bold choice. It certainly stands out." They are smiling, their tone is perfectly sweet, but beneath the surface, they are absolutely eviscerating your taste.
Exactly. A polite smile and a phrase like, "Well, isn't that interesting?" actually masks a subtle, ruthless critique. It is a cultural mechanism designed to maintain order at all costs. You cannot disrupt the pristine surface of the lake, no matter how furiously you are paddling underneath.
I want to bring this back to you, listening right now. Have you ever been in a meeting or a neighborhood association where the politeness felt more like a trap than a warm welcome? Where nobody ever raises their voice, everyone is smiling, but you can feel the absolute crushing weight of their judgment. It is terrifying because you can't fight back against a compliment.
It is psychological warfare wrapped in a cashmere sweater.
Seriously. So if you step back and look at the map we've drawn, you have a region with all these conflicting high-pressure identities. You have the industrial danger of the river, the corporate sterility of the skyways, the progressive protests at the university, the engineered utopias of the suburbs, the flannel ice fishing, and the passive-aggressive yacht clubs. That is a massive amount of psychological tension.
Which requires a very powerful cultural glue to hold it all together. When identities fracture, human beings inevitably unite over two things: sustenance and sound.
The soundtrack and the sustenance of the North. Let's talk about the food first, because the culinary culture here is incredibly specific, and it perfectly reflects everything we've discussed about practicality and endurance. The undisputed king of the table is the hot dish.
The hot dish. For anyone outside the Midwest, a hot dish is essentially a casserole, but the word casserole is considered far too pretentious. The linguistic origins trace back to early 20th century church cookbooks. It is the ultimate manifestation of Lutheran frugality.
It usually involves a starch, a ground meat, a canned vegetable, and a creamy binder, almost always cream of mushroom soup, and often topped with a crispy layer of tater tots.
It is not elegant cuisine. You will not find it in a Michelin-starred restaurant.
No, definitely not.
But it is efficient, communal, and deeply comforting. When you have a massive neighborhood potluck in the dead of winter, or you are dropping off a meal for a grieving family, you don't bring individual artisanal salads. You bring a massive steaming pan of hot dish. It is pure calories and warmth designed to insulate you against the cold.
And then there's the Juicy Lucy. If the hot dish is about frugality, the Juicy Lucy is about thermodynamic genius.
It is a remarkable piece of culinary engineering. Two rival bars in South Minneapolis, Matt's Bar and the 5-8 Club, both claim to have invented it in the 1950s.
The concept is brilliant. Instead of putting the cheese on top of the hamburger patty where it can slide off into the fire, you seal the cheese inside the raw meat before you grill it.
Right, creating a pocket.
Yeah. And as the burger cooks, the cheese inside melts into this molten liquid core. When you take your first bite, you have to be incredibly careful, or a geyser of liquid American cheese will erupt and literally burn your chin. It's slightly perilous, deeply satisfying, and pairs perfectly with a side of deep-fried cheese curds at the state fair.
It is a hearty, gray sky diet designed to pad your ribs. But if the food is built for endurance and survival, the music of this region serves the exact opposite purpose. The music is the release valve.
The soundtrack of the North. You cannot talk about this region without acknowledging its monumental footprint in global music. You have Bob Dylan, born Robert Zimmerman, up in the iron mining towns of northern Minnesota. He came down to the University of Minnesota in the early 1960s, hung out in a neighborhood called Dinkytown, and absorbed the folk traditions of the river.
Dylan represents the storytelling, the acoustic echo of the timber yards and the working class. He took the grit of the Devon persona and turned it into the voice of a generation. But then, a few decades later, you have the absolute inverse of that acoustic folk sound. You have the Minneapolis sound. Prince, birthed out of North Minneapolis and eventually building his massive Paisley Park studio out in Chanhassen, tying right back to our suburban personas.
I mean, think about the clash of cultures there. We just spent 20 minutes talking about Minnesota nice, about blending in, about quiet humility, wearing practical heavy coats, and hiding your eccentricities so you don't bother your neighbors. And against that conservative gray backdrop, here comes Prince.
He was a cultural explosion. Prince utilized early synthesizers and the Linn LM1 drum machine to pioneer a fusion of funk, synth-pop, rock guitar, and R&B, and he paired it with an unapologetic, flamboyant, hypersexual visual aesthetic. Velvet suits, lace, high heels.
He was everything the culture told you not to be. He was loud, he was provocative, and he was impossible to ignore. And yet, the region fiercely claims him. Because subconsciously, I think, a culture that repressed needs an avatar of absolute freedom.
That is exactly the mechanism. The environment demands conformity and practicality. The internal spirit demands expression. You see that same independent, introspective spirit evolving into a massive indie and hip-hop scene later on. Labels like Rhymesayers Entertainment, artists like Atmosphere, bringing a very laid-back but grinding working-class storytelling to hip-hop. Or Lizzo, who refined her powerhouse, self-affirming sound while cutting her teeth in the Minneapolis indie scene.
And wrapping all of this culture together, the food, the music, the polite neighborly interactions, is a very specific linguistic comfort food, the accents.
The vowel shifts are legendary. The way bag is pronounced with a long A as bag.
And the constant use of the Scandinavian phrase, oofda.
Oofda is fascinating because it is a multi-purpose emotional dampener. You say it when you lift something heavy, when you hear a mild piece of bad news, or when you are simply exhausted. It is an entire vernacular designed to be approachable, non-threatening, and to keep the social gears lubricated.
So we have laid out all the pieces of the map. We have the industrial work ethic of the flour mills. We have the climate-controlled corporate safety of the skyways, the engineered utopias of the suburbs, the passive-aggressive politeness of the lakes, the communal casseroles, the underground funk, the oofda.
Which brings us to the crux of the entire deep dive. When you combine all of these geographical, historical, and cultural forces, what does it actually do to the human mind?
We are entering the deep psychology, the intellectual climax of our journey. If we look at the center of this map, there's a region known as Southwest Minneapolis. And the psychological profile of this area is defined by a phrase from the text that absolutely stopped me in my tracks. Stability inside proximity to chaos.
Let's unpack that. Southwest Minneapolis isn't as flashy or status-obsessed as the yacht clubs of Wayzata. And it isn't as intensely corporate and sterile as downtown. It sits in the middle, it borders the urban grit, but it is deeply residential, anchored by a chain of beautiful, integrated city lakes, like Makaska.
But the way they use that nature is different. If you live in Southwest Minneapolis, nature isn't a reward. It's not a remote cabin you escape to for a week in the summer. It is a tool for daily regulation.
Precisely. If you've ever felt guilty for not going for a 5-mile run on a beautiful Saturday morning, you are experiencing a microdose of what drives this area. You run the trails around the lake after work. You cross-country ski in the winter. You bike to the co-op grocery store instead of driving. Nature is integrated into the routine of maintaining your mental and physical health because you desperately need that regulation to handle the pressure of sustained success.
Sustained success. Explain the mechanics of that, because it goes against the typical American narrative.
The classic American narrative is about the hustle. It's the boomtown mentality. You go to New York or Silicon Valley to take massive, chaotic risks to make it big. Or, conversely, towns are defined by what they lack, fighting tooth and nail to revitalize a dying industry. But this highly optimized Midwestern culture is neither of those things. It is not where people go to hit it big, and it is not where they hit rock bottom. It is where people go to maintain a life that already works.
It's the home of dual-income households, established professionals, people who have essentially, figured it out.
It is positive inertia. The systems are already built, and they work exceptionally well. The public schools are highly rated. The parks are impeccably clean. The regional economy, diversified across healthcare, retail, and agriculture, is stable. Therefore, the primary object of life becomes simply not messing it up.
And that introduces the ultimate psychological diagnosis of this entire region: low conflict optimization.
It is a heavy burden, cleverly disguised as a blessing.
Okay, I have to push back on this, because when you say low conflict optimization, it sounds incredibly peaceful. It sounds like everyone is just doing yoga and eating organic vegetables and getting along. Doesn't that just sound like a fancy academic term for repression? If you're never allowed to show conflict, aren't people just boiling over in private?
You've hit the nail on the head. That is exactly the trap. The pressure here is entirely invisible. There is a quiet, unspoken expectation woven into the fabric of the community. You must be physically healthy. You must be successful at your job. You must have a perfectly balanced work-life dynamic. You must be an incredibly present, enlightened parent. You must be socially aware and progressive. And you have to do all of this flawlessly with a smile on your face without ever breaking a sweat.
And nobody is ever going to explicitly demand it of you.
Because of Minnesota Nice. They won't yell at you if you fail. They won't confront you. But they will quietly observe. The judgment is internalized. The pressure doesn't come from a boss or a dictator. It comes from looking at your neighbor's perfectly shoveled driveway and feeling a deep existential dread that your life isn't as optimized as theirs.
I want you to picture keeping a high-end luxury car idling perfectly at 60 miles an hour, forever. There are no dramatic crashes. There are no fiery explosions like the old flour mills. The road is smooth, but the engine is always, always running. The mental toll of having to endlessly optimize your life without ever showing signs of conflict or struggle, it has to be deeply exhausting.
It is the exhaustion of having it all together. Most places are defined by what they chase, which creates a frantic, forward-leaning energy. This culture is defined by what it already has and the crushing responsibility to maintain it perfectly. You aren't building a life from scratch, and you aren't breaking a life down. You are just maintaining it.
And if you are listening to this right now, no matter where you live, I bet you have felt that specific brand of exhaustion, the exhaustion of low conflict optimization in your own career, trying to answer emails at 9 p.m. while pretending you have a great work-life balance, the pressure in your own parenting, trying to engineer the perfect childhood.
It is the modern condition, the desire to engineer away all the friction of life, perfectly captured in the geography of the American Midwest.
Wow. Let's take a breath and synthesize this incredible journey. We started with raw nature, the 11,800 glacial lakes, and the brutal, explosive flour mills of the Mississippi River. We learned how the wealth from that dangerous velocity built a city so optimized they enclosed it in glass skyways to defy the winter. We marveled at the engineered utopias of the suburbs, replacing outdoor baseball and historical battlegrounds with climate-controlled roller coasters. We navigated the velvet trap of Minnesota Nice on the wealthy lakefronts. We fueled up on molten cheeseburgers and hotdish, and found release in the revolutionary funk of the Minneapolis Sound.
And we arrived at the psychological climax, the invisible, exhausting weight of the perfectly optimized life, the positive inertia of just keeping the engine running smoothly forever.
Which leaves us with one final, lingering question, a thought to mull over long after this audio stops. We've established that this entire region's identity, from the planned communities to the park trails, is built around maintaining a perfectly optimized, well-built life. But what happens when the definition of a perfect life fundamentally changes.
That is the ultimate unknown. You have a new generation looking at this beautifully manicured, highly pressured system. What if they decide they don't want to maintain it? What if the exhaustion of low conflict optimization is too much? If they decide they want to be loud, to embrace conflict instead of optimizing it away, will the systems of positive inertia keep running? Or will that quiet, polite surface finally crack?
A fascinating thought to leave you with. I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I encourage you to walk out your front door, look at your own neighborhood, look at your own daily routine, and ask yourself, are we building, are we breaking, or are we just quietly, exhaustingly maintaining?
Until next time.
Remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the physical danger you can see. It's the smooth, optimized, velvet-lined trap you don't even realize you're living in. Keep diving deep.